So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you New Hampshire or Volunteer New Hampshire for hosting this event and for inviting us to speak. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk about engaging youth in meaningful ways. My name is Maura and I am the program director at the New Hampshire Teen Institute. I first became involved with TI back in 2008 when I volunteered for our summer program. And really, I never left from there. So in 2017, after a lot of years volunteering, I became the program director. And one of the things that I do as program director is engage youth regularly. We have programs throughout the year that we offer for both middle and high school students, where we look at ways that they can participate in their communities, whether that's through their school or through after school programs, through other events and things that are happening in their communities and where they can make change and where they can have a voice in their communities. The New Hampshire Teen Institute really looks to empower youth to unlock their leadership abilities. We really believe that everybody can be a leader, and that it just takes a lot of working together in order to help youth find those leadership voices that they have and to find those abilities that they have. So there's not one way to be a leader. There's not one way to engage in leadership. So we really like to think about how we can work with youth to find those different avenues for their own leadership. Leaders are people who listen, who push others out of their comfort zone in really healthy ways, who educate, who hold open space for people to explore different interests that they may have. So anything from that one-on-one kind of conversation that really helps someone explore something new, to those who are really comfortable in front of a real large crowd and getting people pumped up for an event. And everything in between is what we look at for leadership. And one of the most important things that we really believe at the New Hampshire Teen Institute is that when you engage youth in meaningful ways, it not only helps to unlock their own individual leadership abilities and potential, but it also helps and works as a protective factor for youth, so that we are looking at ways to help them engage in really healthy ways with their communities. And that can be a protective factor against substance misuse and other harmful behaviors that sometimes happen in your teen years. So this session is really a beginner session in covering the basics of youth engagement. And what we want to talk about today is why youth voices matter, the benefits of youth engagement, ways that you can engage youth, and what meaningful engagement can really look like, and what it doesn't look like, because that sometimes can be really helpful to understand. And anything that is worth doing really does take time and thought and planning. So not only do we have to think about ways to engage youth, but we also have to think about ways or why we haven't engaged youth before. So much of why youth isn't brought to the table can be because of assumptions that we make about youth. There are a lot of back and forth between the generations. I'm sure we've all remember back to our own teen years when generations before us maybe had some thoughts or ideas about how we were different than them and ways that we did things that they didn't do things, and all of that kind of stuff. So when you have that back and forth, a lot of times we kind of take away that idea that youth have a voice, because their voice is different than ours, or their voice might push back on some of the things that we typically do. So how does that impact things? So what I'd really like to see is some, have everybody type into the chat as you're comfortable. What are some of the things that we hear about youth today? So when you think about youth, what are some of the things you hear from people that you work with, or from people in your community, or people online when they talk about youth today? All right, so not motivated. They spend all their time on social media and gaming. More civically active. Youth are lazy. High rates of anxiety. Disrespectful. All they care about is social media. They don't care about school. That kids aren't mature as they used to be. That they're entitled. That there's a lot of poverty. Anxiety came up again. Tied to phones. People are quick to say that their ideas are too radical. Unable to make commitments. They are the future. Lazy and don't listen. Pragmatic. Involved with their communities and social issues. Entitled. Involved in too many activities. Lack of respect. Gen Z is wild. They need guidance. Lacking social skills because there's too much time on screens. Youth today are said to be disconnected from reality and anxious and depressed, that they don't have a work ethic. That's come up a couple times. Feel like they don't belong. Left behind, particularly minorities. High expectations on themselves. Their favorite word is maybe. That one I've never heard before. That's funny. Generally more accepting of people. More accepting, yeah. Want to have a voice. Yeah, so those are really good. So a lot of those are on the negative side, right? So a lot of times when we hear about what adults or how adults describe youth, it can be focusing more on the negatives or the differences. But there were also some great positives in that list as well, that they are engaged, that they are civic minded. So when we think about that list of things and we think about engaging youth, it's really important to think how both of those lists can be really positively impacted by engaging youth in different ways. So they do things differently, they see things differently, they act and interact differently than we may have when we were youth. But it's not better or worse, it's different. And really finding that bridge between adult and youth differences is the way that we can really help to engage youth and to impact how they feel about their community and how community feels about them. So what we're going to do first I'm going to ask that everybody puts aside all of those more kind of negative thoughts around youth today, right? And focus on those more positive things that we listed in around youth today. But also I'd like to take a moment, and this is in a moment we're going to do our first breakout, to really think back to your teen years. So what are the things you remember older generations saying about you? Was it similar to the things that you listed in the chat? Was it different? Were they correct? And how did those things make you feel? And then think a little bit about issues that maybe impacted your family or your friends, your community, your school, what was happening in the world. And did you have any voice in those conversations or in the decisions being made about those things? And if you were able to have a voice in those things, how did that feel? What was the impact? And if not, how did that feel? And how could things have been different if you had had a voice in those conversations? So Emily's going to break us out into some groups so that you can talk about these things. And then when we come back, any groups that want to share some thoughts on it would be really great to hear from. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you had some good discussions there with such a large group. We really wanted to have the opportunity for a little smaller grouping so we could chat. But what I'd love to hear is some thoughts that anyone is willing to share from their chat around this prompt. So if you want to type your name in the chat if you're interested in sharing, and once I see some names, I'll call on names. And if you want to unmute yourself and share for a moment, and then we'll see how many we can get to. And I keep forgetting that if I move my mouse, I move the slideshow, so I apologize for that. Okay, so Arlene McGowan, if you want to share a little.
Alt.
Okay, I think I just unmuted you, Arlene.
Great.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
So we had a really interesting group because we have all the different generations in there. I'm from the radical 70s, and then we had some Gen X's and some millennials in our group. And so how they answered the questions was really interesting. And so some of it is similar to how we might look at generations today. And we got down to exploring how that reflects on kids as they grow up. They sort of have to overcome those negative references or negative perceptions and then move past that. But I have to say, the women in my group are strong and they're beautiful women who have overcome these things and are sort of moving ahead in their careers in a great way. So
That's great.
It was an interesting group.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And then Leslie, you want to unmute Leslie for sharing?
Hi. Yes, so we had a few different generations in our group as well. I think one of the bigger pieces we talked about was that from generation to generation, the older generation always says that the younger generation lacks respect and doesn't have as much of a work ethic as the generation before them. And I don't know if that just has to do with being younger, but all of us said that we heard that from the generation before ours.
Yeah.
And then a piece of that we talked about was maybe how different generations express themselves, either through language or what they wear or the music that they listen to, that's always kind of radical to their parents or the generation before them, and it makes it more difficult to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Peggy Varney is next.
Well, I think the same thing that I've been hearing other people say. We had a multi-generational group, which was really interesting, and it was interesting to see the same thing. It's that generations always said the same things to generations. And I like what you said about clothing, music, all that. You're right. And no matter how far back we look, you see the same things. I mean, we can go back to the 80s and look at like videos that say the same things about the next generation and the next generation. And that was really cool to see. And we talked, we got into a little bit, just started to get a little bit about what things you were facing within your community at that time. For me, it was, like the Vietnam War and voting and all those, things that we were fighting for. In other generations, the fight might not be so substantial. And that was interesting to see. Or the personal battles more than the community or even national battles. It was great. Thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you. I'm glad that it seems to have had a good conversation starter for everyone, which I think is so great. I appreciate that. Let's hear from Lilo.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about technology in our group. And one of the things I noticed in the initial activity was that some of the traits that our generation, like my generation, Generation Z, is always just on technology and on our phones, and how it's sort of misunderstood because it's a really powerful tool for mobilizing the youth, and how it's often used as a way to reach people like in our activism, which just isn't necessarily understood by older generations, because sort of as soon as the older generations start to understand the social media platform and get on it, that's when all the young kids are like, we're done with it, and they move on to the next thing. And just how that kind of creates like a miscommunication and a misunderstanding of how maybe the youth is trying to act and mobilize and what we're doing.
Great, thank you. And Kim Whitefeather Altamare, I hope I'm saying that right.
Altamari, actually.
Thank you, Altamari.
We had a great discussion group. I had a hard time because I just got this computer and I had a hard time pulling up the questions. But we had a diverse group in there. We had between Gen Y, Gen Z, my generation, which was the Gen X. We had some really good questions and answers, and we both, all of us, agreed that a lot of the generation today is afraid to ask questions. They're afraid that they're not going to be heard. They're afraid that they're not going to be acknowledged because of the lack, and so they don't even try. Today's kids don't feel appreciated, just like we did when we were younger, you know, but a lot more now than ever before that I'm seeing, because I go into schools on a regular basis throughout the year doing Native American studies and whatnot, and teaching about Native American heritage and such. And a lot of the kids just sit there with blank stares like, okay, what am I supposed to ask? And they're afraid to ask the question. They're afraid to sound like they're stupid because they're asking a question.
Right.
And so my biggest approach is when I go into the schools, I ask, you know, every student there, do you have any questions? Do you have anything that you want to ask and you're afraid to ask? Because there's not a stupid question out there. The only stupid question is one that's not been asked.
Yeah, thank you. That was really great to have all of that engagement around what it felt like through the different generations. So even though each generation is a little different, we know that by what we're experiencing, what we have for technology has changed over our lifetimes. But the feelings from generation to generation seem to be very similar. So, you know, each generation as they move through life is going to look at the new generation as doing things wrong, or not being engaged enough, or not caring enough, or being lazy. All of those things that we are hearing about youth today, we heard about ourselves when we were youth. So it's really important to think about that and keep that in mind as we go through this session today, and as you bring this information back to your agencies or your community groups or your boardrooms, that it is really important for us to remember that they're where we were at a point in time, and we have the opportunity to really make a change in how they are seen by the world and how they are engaged with these communities. So it's really a great opportunity. So what I would like to do now is go through what youth engagement really means. And I found this great description, this explanation on actforyouth.net. That will be in your packet when you get information later, but it's a great website to check out to really talk about and understand youth engagement and what it is and what it isn't. So when we think about what youth engagement is, it results from that involvement of youth in every aspect of what we're doing. Not just having them at events, but having them be a part of the events that we're putting together, having them have those relationships with the adults in their life that are more like partnerships, that are more reciprocal, that are structured so everyone is contributing and teaching and learning from one another. So this is really a baseline. You know, this session was set up as more of a beginner kind of session, that if you haven't had a lot of youth involvement before, this can really help to like set the tone for what you're looking to do. So it really can be a win-win proposition for everybody. So why do we want to engage youth? Well, because engaged youth become engaged adults. Skilled youth become skilled adults. So we all have a hand in helping youth learn and grow and take these skills that they can utilize in being engaged, and really putting them into practice and learning them and getting really good at them earlier on, so that they feel more confident and they have more ability to ask those questions and to use their voice and to speak up. And what we gain from that, what adults, organizations, and communities gain from that is, you know, increased commitment and energy to organizations. Recognition and attracting more funders who really want to see more engagement by larger groups of people. A lot of diversity so that you're getting different voices happening within your organizations. And I was thinking about this when I was putting together this presentation. You know, we work with youth and we work with people who work with youth. So we're very youth focused. So having a youth voice makes a lot of sense when you're youth focused, right? But what if you work with seniors? How does a youth voice fit in with working with seniors? Or if you work at a hospital, how do youth voices fit in when you work at a hospital or an animal shelter, or different areas where you might not see that direct connection to youth? And when you really think about it, all of the different ways in which youth view the world a little differently can help. All of the ways that we benefit from these relationships with youth are participants in our agencies and in our community groups can also benefit from these things. So bridging those gaps, not just between youth and our organizations, but youth and the populations we serve can be really positive. I think specifically around the senior center, you know, a lot of times when seniors are moving into either assisted living facilities or going to senior centers, some of those relationships they've had with the youth in their life may not be as strong because it can be hard to watch someone that you care about go through the aging process and maybe start to lose some of those abilities that they had when you were younger. But if you are bringing youth together with seniors, you're really improving both the lives of the youth and the lives of the seniors. They get a lot from one another. And by bringing youth in, you can start to have events that would be more interesting to youth that might bring their grandkids back to those places that, oh, that sounds like fun. I could do that with my grandparents and not just sit around a room and, stare at each other awkwardly because they're in an assisted living situation. So there's a lot of ways that you can look at including youth and having that youth voice present that helps. Their knowledge in social media and their way to engage people via social media is a huge help to any agency or group that is trying to get the word out about what they do. So animal shelters are one that can really benefit from that. Campaigns that youth listen to can be really helpful for those kinds of things. So there's lots of ways to engage youth outside of what you traditionally think of as youth-focused work, where youth can bring a lot to the table and get a lot from that mentor relationship with the people that they're working with. So does anybody have any questions at this time before we move on to the next section? I want to make sure that if anybody has any questions or comments, we're hitting those as well.
If they haven't put them in the chat, but please, if you do, feel free to add those in and we'll bring them up.
Great. All right, so I put together kind of what youth engagement isn't versus what youth engagement is, just to kind of bring it out a little more specifically. So bringing in youth after a decision has been made isn't really youth engagement. It's really involving youth prior to either creating a coalition or a community group or before decisions are made in already established groups. Having one youth on your board or committee to speak for all of youth is different than inviting a diverse group of people to take part. And that doesn't mean that you have to have a lot of youth on your board or on your committee, but you have to have a way to reach out to them to get their voice and their involvement. So maybe it's by putting out a survey, maybe it's by doing some kind of poll, so that you can hear from them and hear and get those ideas from them, even if they aren't regularly sitting on boards or in committees. Telling youth what they need versus asking youth what would be helpful. So going back to like working with youth directly, if youth was, if a school was looking at bullying as an issue in their school, telling youth how to deal with it or what to do around bullying is much different than asking them what they're experiencing, what's worked for them, what hasn't worked for them, how they're getting support from people, how they aren't getting support from people. So bringing them into that process before putting things out that are there to help them. Expecting youth to follow along with plans they didn't have a voice in versus having youth take the lead in some meetings and planning and implementation. So community events where, you know, we bring in youth to man a table versus asking youth what kind of activities would be really interesting for youth your age. And then of course, being present in the same room is very different than open and engaging in communication between youth and adults, where you're asking questions of one another while you're listening to what other people have to say, or you're opening up to the possible suggestions that youth might have. So it's a very, you know, it's great to have youth involved, but it's really important to have the engagement be meaningful so that their voice is heard. And those are two different things. So I thought it would be really helpful to hear from an adult and a youth who work together and who really participate in youth engagement on a regular basis, what real youth engagement looks like. So I'd like to welcome both Monica Gallant and Abby Florence from Caste. Caste is the Community Action for Safe Teens group out of the Sauhegan Valley. And I will give them a moment to tell you a little bit about themselves, and then I will show the kind of the prompts that I gave them to talk about.
Monica, do you want to go first?
So do I unmute myself?
Oh, you're unmuted.
You're
Okay.
unmuted.
Okay, so thanks, Abby, and thank you, Maura, for inviting us to join you today. So a quick overview is I'm the Director of Prevention Services of the Boys and Girls Club of Sauhegan Valley, and also Community Action for Safe Teens, which is a youth substance use prevention coalition. And I've been working with the coalition since right around 2011. And I'm really happy to be here today. So Abby, you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Awesome. So, hey everyone, I'm Abby. I'm the youth here. I am 17 years old and I work with Monica at the Boys and Girls Club of Sauhegan Valley and with the Caste Coalition. And I am, I'm young, I'm Gen Z, and I'm ready to talk to you guys about what's going on with us. And that's really my TED Talk for you.
Great. So what I asked Abby and Monica to kind of focus on were these three prompts. So sharing an example of a time or a forum where youth voices were overlooked. How does Caste work with youth in meaningful ways? So some real tangible examples and the benefits that have been seen from this meaningful engagement of youth.
So Abby, you want to go first?
Okay, are we going one question at a time? I think so. Or
yeah,
no?
I think so. I think that would be a good idea.
So
what do you think?
See, there we go. That's a good example. So could you share an example of a time or forum where youth voices were overlooked? So, I mean, other than the whole Caste group, sorry, my sister keeps texting me. Okay. The Caste Coalition works with youth directly, but I'm also part of a couple of other groups that work with youth and kind of just promote youth engagement and youth voice. And I definitely have had personal experiences where my voice and my opinions have been shot down. And that can feel very, 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 very just disempowering, kind of just upsetting, and makes me feel like my voice is not valid and therefore making my opinions and what I care about invalid. And I know people at any age can experience that feeling, but it feels very, very debilitating as a young person to realize air quotes here, that my voice is not important. And it definitely, I've seen it in a lot of situations that can be both personal and group oriented. But I definitely have experienced that on personal and group levels. I don't have any specific examples that I can think of right this second, but I will share one of them later on another question.
Okay. So generally in our community, youth voice is really appreciated. We have held a few like town hall meetings or community events, and people really want to hear from the youth. But one specific example that I did think about when Maura asked us about this was the marijuana issue. We have a lot of youth in the state who are pretty vocal about the detrimental effects of recreational marijuana and how it has the potential to contribute to addiction based on what they've learned on science-based materials. And it continues to come up year after year in our legislative process and they're looking at it as an economic issue, and kind of disregarding the youth voice to a certain degree. So that's pretty much the only example that comes to mind when I think about youth voices being overlooked. So the next question, go ahead, Maura.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, and that's one that I find really interesting, and I'm glad you brought that one up, because that one does impact their future a lot. And youth, because youth aren't able to vote, their voice in that realm is so much more important, because that's the only way that they have to really show their feelings about something like that, to get that through. So that the economic side of things sometimes takes precedence over what worries people have for their future.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Can I add something to that question?
Yeah.
Okay, so I can think of one personal experience that I have had that, like, off the top of my head. I was at a doctor's appointment, and my doctor asked me what I wanted to do when I went to college, and I told him my plan, and I was like, that's what I want to do with my life. And he's like, oh, good luck with that. Let me know when you, like, and it was just like kind of like demeaning what I wanted to do and said I wouldn't be able to do it. And even those like small little things that happen on a fairly like often kind of basis just like don't make me feel very good about myself and make me feel like what I want to do is not really relevant to the world around me. And I also think that just youth in general have, as a generation, our world is changing so much so quickly. And the ways that are usually common for people to change even legislation or change things about society, those like roots of doing those things change so quickly, especially with social media technology and stuff like that. There's different ways to do everything every day, and it makes it hard for youth to kind of like take a step back and form a group that can really be effective.
Yeah.
Are we going on to the next question? Awesome.
Yeah.
So how does Caste work with youth in meaningful ways? Every way. But every group does have progress to make. But one particular example that I can think of happened last year. I went to an event, and it was with the Caste Coalition, and a couple of other youth attended it. And it was designed for high schoolers to kind of share what was going on with us and our generation and problems that kind of could arise at school and what adults could do to solve those problems. And we came back from that event, and I was like, I wish I had that in middle school. Like, so many of those things would have been so useful in middle school. So Cass kind of gave me the platform to kind of like make that brainchild kind of a real thing and make that event really happen. And we got all of the middle schoolers in our group together, and we kind of talked about the issues that they found more relevant, because those did compare differently to high school problems and high school topics. And there were 5 topics we finally decided on, and those topics were like groups and discussion groups, like within that were led by youth, and participated in by youth. And it was just an overall lovely, lovely event. I just use the word lovely so much. It makes me so happy because that event was just so empowering to like see happen and actually create, because youth planned it, youth came up with the idea, and youth participated in it. And it's like the kids bop of kid events, and I just loved it so much. And that we called it the Youth Summit, but it was definitely something that I did. Like, I put it on my college application, I put it on I put it on my resume, just stuff like that. Like, those experiences will kind of just really support me in my future. And youth in general, these opportunities that we have as young people can definitely kind of help us figure out what we want to do in our future.
Great, thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, so how do we work with youth in meaningful ways? First of all, we invite them to the table. And anytime that we have something important to do as the coalition, from the coalition standpoint, I always invite youth, because their perspective is so important on what is happening in our community and things that are important to them. And as we're trying to do our work strategically in preventing youth substance use, or increasing awareness about mental health, we need their voice. They're the ones that are in the trenches, and without them, we know nothing. So we invite youth, and Abby's voice and all of the other members of the Caste Youth Coalition, which is the YES team, whenever they're there, those are the only voices that the adults in the room want to hear. So that's, inviting is the first step, and then listening is the second step. So, and providing them with opportunities. Like Abby said, we love to give the kids the platform to use their voice and to make positive change in the community.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Abby, the benefits for you?
So many benefits, but I definitely feel like just as a young person, I've kind of figured out what I want to dedicate my life to do. And I know that can look different in every single situation with any organization, but giving youth kind of a mini community, I would call it, is just makes it so much more tangible for people to kind of figure out what they look like in their future. Like, I love what Monica does for a living and what Maura does for a living, and both of them, I'm like, yes, just combine those together. That's what I want to do. And but giving youth that kind of thing to look up to, and being that mentor, which I know someone had mentioned previously, is just so important. And what Monica said before, saying that people need to listen to youth. Listen, it doesn't mean just in one ear out the other. It means genuinely listen and consider those ideas. And you don't necessarily need to subscribe to every single idea that a kid comes up with, because I know I've had some weird ideas in the past, but genuinely listening and considering ideas, and even making eye contact, smiling when a kid is talking, just makes them feel like as important and as valued as we are. As I'm almost an adult, so as we are, but but it's just really, really empowering to be supported by people who understand that, just because, as we talked about in my breakout group, is breakout group 10, you guys had the blessing of being born before me. There was nothing that caused that, so we're kind of on the same level. I feel like, not that one of us is better than the other for any age that we are, and it's just really, really empowering to hear that from people that are older than me. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you. So some of the benefits that we've seen is that youth really want to make a difference in their community. So they're gaining, connections and networking with adults in the community, and they are creating a sense of wellness among their peers. So they're mentoring their peers and just strengthening the community by using their voice and taking action, in creating positive change. So they get involved in community service projects. So, some of the other benefits are workforce development, like even Abby's given some examples of she's, thinking about what she wants to do with the rest of her life. So, and we hope that by providing youth with those opportunities from, event planning to, strategic prevention work or connecting with other agencies in our community, they can identify their own strengths and work towards strengthening whatever community they decide to live in.
Yeah. Thank you. We had a couple questions that came up, so I think this might be a good time and for you guys to be part of answering. Some of them are directed at you, and then some of them are general. So what about the nonverbal communications that youth can put off? For example, distant, looking not engaged, not feeling confidence to speak up. In the programs that I do, we do encounter that often. And really what I find to be the most effective is I always take the stance of meeting people where they're at. They don't know me yet. They don't know us yet. So giving time to build some trust is really important. So as Abby was saying, eye contact is really important, but not forcing eye contact on someone who's feeling uncomfortable. So looking at people, giving encouraging, smiling responses, faces are really helpful things to do. And asking questions. So, asking, do you have anything to share? Can be helpful if they don't have the confidence to speak up on their own, but also giving other ways to share. So when possible, giving people time to process a prompt or process something and share with you in a different way. So sometimes allowing for conversations after a meeting or to have feedback come back through a different format can be a way to build that confidence without putting people on the spot to speak. Sometimes when they look not engaged, it's really just they look like they're not engaged, but they are taking in a lot. So just trusting in that process is sometimes hard to do, but important to do.
Yeah.
Abby or Monica, do you have any thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Abby.
So when I work with, usually I do work with younger groups sometimes because I am a camp counselor and I am also working with the Boys and Girls Club. So I do this thing called like 7 seconds of silence. I give people 7 seconds to kind of process what's going on before I like force anyone to say anything or like skip to the next question. Not that I'm saying force anyone to say anything, but if it's like group reading, like give someone 7 seconds to kind of just like take a breath and kind of process what's going on, because even those like small seconds and can just make it so much easier to kind of just get the strength, get rid of the anxiety really quickly, and then stand up for what they believe in, and not just skipping over people like, oh, you can't reply in 0.2 seconds and you can't just like answer on the spot. It just gives kids and even adults, it works with adults too, give people a second to come up with an answer. And it usually works so that they kind of feel that trust is being built and that you're more open to their ideas.
And look for some type of strength or provide some type of affirmation. So there's always something that, you can notice about a youth that they, might not be thinking about. So that's what I like to look for. If they're, if they seem to not be participating, then maybe, just quietly, sharing something that you've noticed about them that's a positive thing.
Great. Abby, there was a comment from Sean, who's a primary doctor, and wanted to apologize on the behalf of your doctor who negated your plans, and wondered if you were willing to share your future plans with us today, more specifically.
So I am going to college, Massachusetts in the fall, and I'm fully double majoring, but I know for a fact I'm majoring in political science and hopefully women and gender studies, because I want to do work with, I don't know exactly what, we'll figure it out, but I want to make the world a better place. That's my goal.
Awesome.
I'm excited.
So there was a question about like substance misuse prevention is a great example of, and especially with the work that I know Monica, Abby, and I all do very specifically substance misuse prevention work. But how does that also kind of bridge to helping kids move forward in the face of negative responses? And I'm guessing from what I'm reading in this, it's about resiliency, how to be resilient in the light of negative experiences. So I believe that prevention and resiliency work hand in hand. The more work you do in prevention, the more resilience you are building in people, whether it's youth or adults. So prevention and resiliency really are very, very cohesive things that work together.
Mhm.
Let's see. A lot of thumbs up for Caste throughout the comments. Caste is very well known. Caste is awesome. Let's see if we could. I like a great tip on the 7 seconds. Let's see. Abby, you're very impressive. We all agree on that. Let's see. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left in the session. So thank you, Monica and Abby, for sharing on those things. I think that seeing hearing about how that works really well and how you've used that with different age groups is really important to talking about this stuff. So I did have one other kind of prompt that I wanted to talk about before we end today, and that is really questions to ask around youth engagement. So I want you all to think for a moment what the purpose of your specific group or organization is, whether that's the one that brought you here today or another one that you work at. What are the populations that you're looking to impact with your work? So are you working, with a single population? Are you working with lots of different populations? What are some of the reasons you think that you haven't had youth involvement in your organizations? What are some perspectives that youth voices might bring to the conversation that we aren't hearing? What are the barriers that you have to youth involvement in your group? Is it that you don't know any youth who might be interested in what you're doing? Is it that you've never thought to have youth before? Is it that the rest of your group would be very against having youth involvement? And what is the first step that you can commit to around having youth involvement in your group? So we were going to do this as a breakout session, so I think that still could be really helpful to kind of break out for a few minutes and just talk about maybe the last 2 questions. So what are the barriers to youth involvement for your groups, and what is the first step you can commit to get some youth involvement in your group? So let's take about 5 minutes to talk about it, and then we'll come back and do a couple reporting out and then some final questions if there are any. So I was so worried I would not fill enough of this hour, and we are at the end, so I don't want to keep people much longer. I do want to bring up one thing that Lilo had put through to everybody, which I think is really important, that there's a lot of misunderstanding around why youth today are seeming to be disheartened or negative, and they really do have a lot of things looming for them as they look forward to their lifespan. So it's important to remember that a lot of what they're feeling has to do with what they're looking at in the world, and they have very, very little around being able to make decisions around these things, around they can't vote for what they believe in yet. They can't make those changes through those ways. So the more we can engage them in the organizations and communities in which they live, the more voice that they have, and the more positive you start to feel when you can see that your voice can make change and you can bring change to the community in which you live. So thank you, Lilo, for sharing that, because that is a really important thing. I think that we would love to be able to hear from people in the chat. What is that first step you can commit to around youth involvement for your group. So if people could start putting that in the chat, we're going to keep all of that information and share it so everybody can get different ideas from that list. And while you guys are putting that into the chat, I am going to kind of close out a little bit with my final thoughts and some things you can bring back to your groups and committees. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining today. We really, truly believe that the more voice that everybody has, including youth and especially youth, the better our communities are, both at large and for the youth that we are fostering and engaging and mentoring into adulthood. So I think that's really, really important. Both these breakout session prompts will be coming to you in the packet that you'll receive afterwards. So please use them with your groups. Going back and thinking back how it was to be a teen can really help to put into perspective how we talk about teens. And thinking about youth engagement, bringing these questions back to your group saying, hey, why don't we do this? What really are the barriers? I think can be a really great way to start that conversation. So I appreciate everybody's time and everybody's engagement today, and doing everything via Zoom is so different, but it was really enjoyable. I'm loving reading what you guys are saying. You know, using different words to describe youth, like passionate, diverse, empathetic, and resilient, giving them a voice, connecting with them, giving more opportunities for them to speak, giving them the space to speak. Inviting them, just inviting them is so important. So for everybody, you know, for them to have a voice and them to have a choice on how things are going. Creating partnerships with schools to develop different clubs and things, which can be smaller versions of some of the organizations. And youth are not always aware that they can have an impact on their communities through disaster preparedness for communities and for different opportunities through organizations like FEMA and their state. So looking at all of those different ways that we can engage youth and get them involved.
Just not fair to people.
I'm sorry? Oh, must have. Is a really important thing to look at. All right, so thank you again. We're just past 3 o'clock, so I hope you all had a great opportunity this week with the Volunteer New Hampshire sessions that you got to go to, and I hope you enjoyed today. I really enjoyed seeing all your faces and hope that you all have a great rest of your summer.